Hello and welcome to Teenagers Untangled, the audio hug for parents going through the teenage years. I'm Rachel Richards, parenting coach, journalist, mother of 2 teenagers and 2 bonus daughters. Now, you know I love putting our parenting in context, so I'm very excited that we're joined today by Dr. Eliza Filby, a historian specialising in generational studies. And she's the author of the book Inheritocracy. It's time to talk about the bank of mum and dad. What is an inheritocracy?
So it's this word that I sort of came up with to explain what's really happened over the last sort of, I think, 20 years, is that for anyone under the age of 45, and there's a definite reason why I'm saying 45 and not older, it's not what you're learning anymore because the return on that investment in education is declining. It stalled initially and is now declining. It's not what you're earning anymore because wages have, by and large, in Europe, the UK, less so in America, stalled since the 2008 financial crisis. Increasingly, your access to opportunity, your access to a safety net if you need it, your access to a springboard, particularly around housing, is more and more than ever conditioned on whether you have access to the bank of mum and dad. And the social divide within the millennial demographic and now the Gen Z demographic is between those that have the bank of mum and dad and those that do not. And we're not talking about the 1% here. We're not even talking about the 10%. We're really talking about the way in which, at a time when the state retracted, became smaller and you know, the market, particularly in respect to housing, but also education and childcare, has become more dysfunctional. Who has stepped up and trickled that wealth down, if they had it? Mum and dad. And now increasingly, the bank of grandma and granddad. And it's really creating a huge social and economic divide between young people.
I don't think we've been really honest about it or have really recognised it. But it's impacting everything. What can you talk more about with the impact this has on our lives?
Yeah, I mean, that's what the book was about, really, because I was that diligent, conscientious girl that did really well in school and was the first person in my family to go to university. And I was very much committed and had a sincere belief in the education pathway to opportunity. Now, that is true to an extent, right? But increasingly, education and your access to even getting to university, or certainly a good university, is increasingly determined by parental wealth. And the rise of tutoring, private tutoring, the rise of people moving house for a good school. You know, education isn't a meritocracy, and it's increasingly become one governed by parental wealth. But I grew up with this idea of education being this pathway. So I wrote the book from a really selfish perspective, which was, why is it that I worked really hard in school and I stayed at university and I got a PhD, but actually when it came to being, as I describe in the book, broke in my 30s, I had a part-time job in a university, I had a cleaning job to keep basically me afloat. The safety net I needed, and then eventually the springboard that got me into buying my first house, was my parents and not my education. And we have created an economy now, certainly in the UK, where the Bank of Mum and Dad is the 6th largest mortgage lender in the UK. And your access to gaining a house is more dependent on you being, frankly, loyal to your parents than being loyal to your boss. And so we talk about, you know, people being disenfranchised or disincentivized by work these days, and particularly amongst young people. Yeah, there's a reason for that, because work doesn't buy us what it bought our parents. It's changed quite significantly over the last 20 years. So I was the generation, literally on the 1999, when Tony Blair stood up and said, we're going to get 50% of school leavers to go to university. That was me in that moment. And I was also the first year that paid £1,000 a year tuition fees, right? Now, what's happened over the last 20 years has been, not only has the price of that degree gone up, and we know that the incremental fees not just went from £3,000 a year to then £9,000 a year, but critically, accommodation costs. You know, accommodation costs have gone up around 18% since the pandemic. So you have the increasing price of university falling on parents. So the price of that degree has gone up, but also the value of that degree has gone down as more and more people have got them. inevitably. There was a scarcity of professional level graduates in the 1980s. They benefited from that education in a way that, frankly, graduates do not. So it became about what university you went to and increasingly what subject you studied at university. STEM graduates, particularly those that are employed outside London and can command high wages in a highly skilled, highly desirable professions, are doing very well. That education has paid off. But other degrees, I'm not going to reference Mickey Mouse degrees, but other subjects, other universities, that education, that investment has not paid. So I think what's interesting and what I'm seeing, baby boomers grew up in this idea of grammar school, meritocracy, the brightest rises to the top. Gen X, and I'm assuming you're Gen X, those generations born between Gen X are those born from 1966 to 1980, whose kids are now by and large Gen Z, grew up where more and more of us went to university, but saw the gradual cost of that and the declining reward. And so what's interesting you're seeing now is a lot more parents who are in their 50s and maybe, with kids in their teens going, do you know what? I don't think university is necessarily an absolute. I'm not overly committed that they go. I can also see the real dangers of having all of that cost for me, but also them. The average graduate is kind of accumulating debt in the region of like 50 grand. So,
and in America, it's astronomical in comparison.
And so what's really interesting is things like the amount of parents who are in favor of degree apprenticeships. Earn while you learn. Fantastic idea. I really do think that's going to be the future of higher education. But there's a really sort of self-interest sort of motivation there. Is a lot of parents are going, great, they get a degree and I don't have to pay for it. Yes. So the system that has evolved where increasingly the upfront costs of that tertiary education has fallen on the parents, whilst also the long-term debt burden has fallen on the student, the graduate. And, poorer students are paying vastly huge amount of sums, so much more for that degree than those that can go to university and come out with no debt at all because their parents can pay it up front.
Yeah. And I was one of those people. My parents didn't really look at my education at all. And I managed to get into university, but that was at a time where it was paid for by the state. And my teacher said to me, you have to apply to university. And I was like, why would I do that? And there was a whole system sort of set up to support people who didn't have money, who could go to university. And then I massively benefited from it. But I can see exactly what you're saying. And this shift has happened and we're not really awake to it. We sort of, we know something's going on, but your book is brilliant for actually laying bare what has changed.
It's also something that really needs to be talked about. So for teenagers, and I know a lot of your listeners are parents of teenagers, in the UK, for teenagers, exam anxiety is a greater source of depression and mental illness than body image, issues around body image. And think about the amount of time and energy and focus we put on social media and the challenges that particularly teenage girls feel around body image. Well, exam pressure is exactly, it's up there, if not more important to young people today. And I feel like we need to have a broader conversation. And I would urge any parents out there to think about education, frankly, differently to how you've been told to think about it. Number one, I would say that, and I work with a lot of companies, and I'm hearing this more and more, is the career ladder is rapidly changing because of AI. So we know that big companies are not going to be hiring the same amount of graduates. The automation is going to take away a lot of those roles. And so they're looking for graduates with brilliant interpersonal human skills. Traditional academic skills and traditional even academic qualifications from the best universities have to be, combined with increasing emphasis on soft skills. Now, how do you learn soft skills? I would argue that the education system is not really engineered to build people's soft skills. Okay, they are one area where you are socialized, but one of the critical things, and again, it's something that I hope to instill in my son if he agrees to this, is of young people working.
100%.
Massive drop, really, since the mid-90s onwards, of the number of kids that have Saturday jobs, as it used to be when I was young,
Yes.
just working more broadly. Now, confronting the public, as you I'm sure know, is the quickest way you can learn how to be human.
Absolutely.
And so, in the worst job possible, I mean, I've worked in call centers, I've worked in restaurants, and honestly, those skills I still deploy today. So help your kids educate themselves on soft skills and human skills. And that's talking as well as listening. That is, hearing bad news as well as good news, creating that human resilience. I think that is really critical. I think the second thing is, if university is on the agenda, is think seriously, not just about the university, but about the subject. And I'm someone who is a history graduate, and I definitely feel that whilst I love history and I think it's absolutely critical in training, an analytical mind, I had to be really savvy about how I thought about my career post academia, let alone post education, post first degree. So thinking about what is it, and I'll give you a really classic example of this, is the declining value in the written word. I'm married to a journalist. I used to work in newspapers. We think about, there was a time not so long ago where I would get £800 for an 800-word article. Now I would possibly get more like £150. So we think about the massive decline in appreciation in the digital age of the written word. Book sales. I haven't yet made any money from writing my book, even though it was a Sunday Times top 10 bestseller. So it looks amazing, but I think it's really important to be honest. The economics of publishing are all over the place right now. So thinking about the as we move deeper into a world governed by AI, what is that degree going to get for you? It's great that you love literature. It's great that you love medieval England, but let's be more strategic in our thinking about what skills we can then transfer into the workplace, and what skills are they not on this course or in this university going to teach me that I'm going to actually need to operate. And then the third thing is this idea that we finish our education at 21. Again, I don't think is realistic in a world governed by AI. It's why it's madness to be saddling 21-year-olds with a load of debt, because it's been estimated that if you have a child in their teenage years now, they will have around 17 different employers over the course of their working life. Wow. And 5 different careers. 5. Now, my mother had one career and worked for the same company her entire life. But her daughter, early 40s, millennial, have had 3 distinct careers. So it's happening already, and it will accelerate in Gen Z, Gen Alpha. And that requires constant upskilling.
Yes.
Actually, money to pay for that constant upskilling. One of the things that they're going to have to do is constantly outpace AI. And so that means constantly learning. I'm doing 3 courses at the moment, one in YouTube, one in product design, and another business course, because I just know I'm having to constantly keep learning in order to keep my business kind of future-proofed, basically. So that agility in learning, I think, is going to be so important. And I don't expect the government to help to pay with that. And I certainly don't expect companies to always provide that. What I do expect is individuals to be sort of agile learners. And I think that's really critically important, because school is so focused on subjects and disciplines and departments. And you're a numbers person or you're a humanities person. And I just don't think that's really how the world is going to work in 20 years' time.
One of my recent episodes was on work and this problem that we've got now, that we don't allow kids to work legally in a lot of workplaces until they're 16 because of insurance reasons. But that's not helpful at all. And the other thing that you're talking about is just what we call explorer mode. So Rebecca Winthrop talked about this in The Disengaged Teen, her book, and how it's so important that we try and encourage that explorer mode, that ability to continually learn and to be finding things out rather than just jumping through hoops, which is what our school system is trying to encourage. It's not what we need.
I mean, it's really interesting. I found some data on millennial parents. So millennial parents, obviously younger with younger children by and large, and only 12% of millennials in the UK think their kid will go to university. Now, that is no reflection on their kid's ability. What it is a reflection of a level of disillusionment for a generation that were told education was the path to success. And I think we can't expect the education system. I've worked in it. It's like turning around the Titanic, right? We can't expect the education system to miraculously update itself for the 21st century.
Your research shows that increased financial dependency between generations has actually affected parenting approaches. What have you been seeing?
So I started the book with this idea of kidulthood. So it's this period of life between 18, and I sort of bookmarked it, between 18 and 35, and saw the gradual sort of invention of this new life stage that I coined kidulthood. And it's a period where not just the affluent, but also the less affluent as well, are increasingly reliant, as you go through the generations, still on their parents. So we talk now about the hotel of mum and dad, and almost the expectation now that to a certain degree, older children, adult children are still very much living with their parents well into their 20s, some into their 30s, more sons than daughters, I should add. So that level of financial dependency. There's also, of course, a recognition that parenting is now a 30-year financial investment. Most parents expect to be financing their kids to the age of 30, right? And that data correlates pretty much in the US the same, Canada the same. It's the expectation. The part of that is the overwhelming cost of housing, particularly in the big cities, and the need almost, as I said earlier on, for the bank of mum and dad to step up and help on that sort of first, particularly as a first-time buyer. There's also, I think, and we talked about this a bit before we started filming, is this evolution of the helicopter parent. Conversation starts in the 80s, paranoias about child safety, stranger danger warnings, all of that. And then sort of also this idea of investing in your child. You know, it's almost kind of in that sort of neoliberal age, we adopt the sort of language of economics into parenting, and we start talking about we parent. It becomes a verb, not a noun. We're not parents. We parent, as Richard Reeve says, but also we invest in our children. And the problem with investments, when you invest in something, what that does is create expectation. And so we invest in our children with an expectation that investment materializes and they do well. And it's partly this sort of increasing helicopter parenting that emerges also at the same time more and more women are in the workplace and spending more and more time in the workplace and less time at home. Increasing a decline of free play and much more surveillance parenting. So children have less time basically being on their own. But also a tightening of social mobility, a closing a lot of the doors around economic opportunity, and a fear that our kids will suffer downward social mobility. There's a really interesting sort of convergence of a series of factors that mean that parenting becomes this thing we do for 30 years and is really expensive. It used to be that having kids was a net economic gain, right? You had more kids to work on the land. Now they're an economic drain, okay, which is one of the reasons why people are having fewer children. But it's this constant need to invest in your child to secure them on a path to opportunity that potentially you had or you want them to have because you didn't. And that puts an inordinate amount of pressure on you as parents, right? Puts an amazing amount of pressure on your finances. It creates a huge social divide, which means there's no meritocracy, right? Because this stuff is not based on merit anymore. It's based on the bank of mum and dad. And also it creates an extreme level of pressure on the child.
And the parents as well. I mean, I think the American Surgeon General recently issued a warning about the level of stress parents are feeling because of what's been going on. And you did mention that you think there's kind of been this over-parenting and how that can hinder growth. And I know, having spoken to, I've got two bonus daughters, one of them's 27, the other's 30. And they talk to me about how it's played out with some of their friends, where they've gone out into the workplace and the people who seem least happy are the ones who've had the most help from their parents, which I thought was fascinating. And when I say help, I mean, the parents have constantly sort of just jumped in to help them whenever something's gone wrong, and they've always paid for things. What are your thoughts? What do you get from your research?
Something that I talk a lot about in the book, because I wanted to explore the challenges of having economic privilege and having your mum and dad hover, or sometimes, snowplow, as they say, snowplow parenting in America, remove any economic obstacle. And actually, I'll tell this story of someone I interviewed in the book, because I think it illustrates this point really well. That there was one millennial I spoke to, someone from a very privileged part of southeast England, had grown up in luxury, had nannies. Both his parents were lawyers, but very loving family. Had prep school and private school, and then straight to Oxford. And he graduated from Oxford. And his parents like, right, what do you want to do? And he said, I want to become an actor. So his mother actually had access to, for free, a Zone 1 flat that he lived in. He said, I didn't need to, throughout my sort of, not just drama school, but acting years, I didn't have to work. It was only sort of for sort of pocket money, but essentially my parents paid for everything. And he said, do you know what? I just really wish they hadn't. Because what happened, trying to be an actor, he did not become an actor in that sort of, economically viable sense. And he then subsequently found his calling, got married, and has since had a child. And he is very angry at himself, not at his parents, for wasting that time, wasting that money, and wasting that investment. And he sees it as, he said, I'm very embarrassed by those 8 years when I should have basically had a kick up the bum and done something productive, done something. And what's interesting is he married a woman who had no help from the bank of mum and dad, was so financially savvy that by the time they came to buying a house, their first home, his parents' contribution was matched by something that she herself had entirely saved. And he speaks about her with such level of admiration, because he never basically was forced to do that. But also he speaks about his son and the life that he's giving his son with a great level of reservation, because he says, I'm not going to be able to recreate the life my parents built for me. And part of that sort of is down to the amount of levels the many years I pissed around doing nothing and spending money that I should have, made or saved. And I think in his story, and there are a number in the book like this, is actually show me the way, don't completely make it easy, to do, and facilitate and enable me, don't disable me with money or help. I think what I see a lot in, and frankly, my own life, I will say, many a years did I spend indulging in a PhD when I should have been earning money, or certainly focusing my life, is actually the bank of mum and dad is disabling as much as enabling. And I have one example that I thought was really interesting. There's one guy I interviewed whose dad gave him a deposit for a house but acted like a bank. And so he has to pay him back, and he has to pay him back with interest. And I actually think that he said himself, I can't default with my parents in a way that I could probably default with a bank. And I thought, there's an interesting tale of parental discipline.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. And I think a lot of parents would go, I wouldn't want that relationship with my child. But a friend of mine was exactly like that. She was one of those kids who had a very fortunate upbringing, but her parents took that approach. Whenever she said, I want to learn to fly. And her father said, right, okay, let's set out your plan. How are you going to do it? And what we have to do is work out the economics, because you're paying me back. And it really focuses the mind. it's very normal in Indian culture to all live together and to support their kids in a different way. What can you talk more about what you discovered with that?
That's really interesting because I interviewed one woman from Mumbai who is now living in London, but so, I'd really like to interview about the sort of the cultural differences in India when it comes to the bank of mum and dad. Even that phrase doesn't really translate. And she said, why are you writing a book on the bank of mum and dad? This is not an issue. And she's quite right, because, culturally, she said, I have had parents who from the earliest years were saving for my wedding and saving for my education. She had access to her education. She got to study animation in New York for 5 years, extraordinary opportunity. She managed to, through her marriage to her husband, his parents had paid for them to live in London. And this is the critical point, is she then very much expects that to be paid back. Not in the form of the loan to be repaid, because she remembers encountering some people in America where she was like, yeah, I met friends of mine who were talking about having to pay back their parents. And she was like, that would never be an issue. She said, where the kind of reciprocal dynamic of that relationship plays out is, of course, she said very confidently that within a matter of years, they would return to Mumbai and live with her parents as her parents got older. And that kind of expectation and flow of responsibility and money, both up and down the family tree, is just that level of intergenerational sort of dynamic that actually, interestingly, you're seeing more and more of in Western societies. We are, in fact, becoming more Asian in that respect. But then are we? Because we also have an aging society where the expectation is that we look after our parents, but in many instances, we can't, or we won't, or it's not evenly distributed across the siblings. And I think the traditional expectation is that elder care falls on women as well. And so in Western societies, there's a certain complexity around elder care falling on a demographic of women who not only need to keep working, but also want to keep working and don't want.
And some of whom are actually parenting, because we've got this sandwich generation of people whose parents have become elderly and they're looking after teenagers.
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of teenagers are looking after the elderly. I mean, a quarter of Gen Z in the UK look after older grandparents. So that there is a greater degree of intergenerational care and that kind of flow of responsibility going up and down the family tree. But also, that I spoke to one woman in the book, Carol from Wales, and she was saying that she was one of three. She didn't get married or have children like her siblings. She ended up living with her parents for a lot longer than she thought she ever would. Her father died. She then took her mother under her wing and looked after her. And she ended up caring for her mother for over 14 years. And for the last 3, her mother was bedbound. Now, that responsibility fell on her, in her words, because she didn't have children and she wasn't married, unlike her siblings, who did significantly less of the care. And in her own words, she felt trapped. And she felt trapped to a degree that caused amazing amount of resentment within her family. And I think we also need to have a sort of societal reckoning of what an aging society means. It's not just that you may be sandwiched in between looking after your kids and grandparents. You may have to leave the workforce. You may have to take out a second, remortgage your home for care costs. There's a whole host of complexities around elder care that I frankly feel like we're just not really talking about to the same degree.
My goodness, yeah.
We're not talking about the bank of mum and dad and how much our parents have helped us, or you are, listeners, helping your kids. And I'll just finish with this. The number of parents in their 50s that I interviewed around this wonderfully, brilliantly said to me, I have been through the social care system with my parents. I know how, challenging it is, how awful it is. I do not want that for myself, and I don't want to be a burden to my children. Now, that's quite right. Who does want to be a burden to their children? But the fact is that social care is now more expensive than eating, and is going up faster than the cost of housing. And we're living approximately 15% of our lives in ill health, managing illnesses. So as much as you don't want to be a burden to your children, the realities are that you probably will be to some degree.
Mm-hmm. I love that. I think that's such an important point. And I think the politicians aren't talking enough about this. There's been a massive, every time I see the statistics coming out, there are fewer and fewer babies being born. And there is a massive growth in old people. And my kid, even the other day, my kid turned to me and asked me about money and, inheritance. And I said, the thing is, darling, we need to save money because otherwise you're going to end up having to leave work and look after us. So we need to have this as a nest egg, rather than handing it out to you at this stage. There needs to be something building up as well.
I think that's really interesting that you say that. And I think it's really good that you're honest about that, because a lot of parents are being more generous to their kids than they can afford to be, and haven't talked about social care at all. And I was interviewing one woman who was 61, and she said, oh, my mum died young. I don't think it'll be a problem for me. I just want to see that my kids are secure. And I thought, that's a really interesting, benevolent way of thinking about it, but also really worrying as well.
Yes. And it's so funny because we were talking about dogs just before we came on, and how a friend I've been talking to, when I said, oh, don't you have insurance for your dog? And she said, oh, no, they just die of cancer. She'll die. And I said, no, but they don't. They don't. And you love them. And then they end up having to have huge, expensive medical care over a significant period of time as they kind of slowly decline. And that's what happens to human beings too. So, and also you had a whole chapter in your book about how inheritance works. And there was an example.
Conversation, sorry.
I know it is, but I want to unpick it. And actually, my podcast is always about positive. So don't worry, we will be talking about how we can tackle this. But I think we have to kind of put it all out on the table. We have to think about this stuff, because I think that the mental shift hasn't happened for a lot of us. And I think it's important. But I'm interested in coming back to this relationship of money. So you've got sort of Generation X, say, who've got a certain nest egg, or even the older, the boomers, and there's money higher up the tree, and they're trickling it down. Some of it's going to be released reasonably soon, but there's the money is being held, and the younger people coming through don't have access to it except through their mum and dad. But that changes the dynamic. You're being infantilized by your parents. They're sort of saying, well, it's all right, I might give you a handout, but you have to be nice to me. And it's a different dynamic, isn't it?
Economic infantilization that I don't think is particularly good for the individual or society, because essentially you're saying that work doesn't pay, parental wealth does. And you're also saying that I can never really break or cut the umbilical cord. And unfortunately, and I speak as a mother who really struggles with this, is when you are pregnant, the baby is inside of you. When you give birth, the baby comes out of you. As they go to school, they become individuals. As they enter teenagehood, their friends become more important than their parents. As they enter the world of work, they build their own wealth. They are literally getting further and further away from you. That is the process of building a human being that can survive on their own. If we get to the most sort of anthropological about this, that is the whole point of being a parent, is to create a resilient, independent person that is independent and resilient of you. And I would say to that, and multi-generational holidays is something I'm massively fascinated by. So I'm saying, taking your 20-somethings and your 30-somethings on a multi-generational holiday that you're entirely paying for, by the way, which is the massive trend of the last 10 years, is questionable. Because when I asked millennials, would you go on that holiday if you were paying or it was being shared, the majority said no. But when you asked baby boomers, would you go on that holiday? Do you think others would come on that holiday if it was shared? The majority said yes. So there is an economic imbalance within families that we have to basically just, again, be honest about and say, yes, we love each other. Of course we love each other. But underscoring a lot of that is an economic dynamic that is imbalanced. Yes. And by the way, that's some, not all, because there's a lot of millennials that are financially supporting their parents. and a lot of Gen Xers that are still, financially supporting their parents. So this is not, we can't be too general in our descriptions here, but we also can't assume that we just love hanging out together.
What I understand from this discussion as a parent of both a millennial and some Gen Zs is that we need to be much more open discussing how does inheritance work in the family, be honest about the things that they're up against, but also how society has shifted.
I think one of the most important things is to recognise the societal shift that's taken place over the last sort of, I would say, broadly speaking, 50 years, but really heavily in the last 20. It used to be that children were scared of their parents. In the last 20 years, I would say that's been completely inverted.
Yes,
and that the parents have become scared of the kids. And there's a level of deference that now is to the child. To a certain degree, that's really healthy, right? Because young people have a voice and a sense of autonomy, and there's a much more democratic feel around most dinner tables, right? And that's great. We shouldn't live in fear of our elders. But there's also something that's been fundamentally lost there. And I see it a lot in workplaces. So if you've got Gen Z who've grown up in households where it's very much like, what do you want for dinner? My grandmother would never have said, what do you want?
No, I don't say that.
Here's dinner.
This is what's on dinner. Yeah, this is.
Where should we go on holiday? You've got YouTube. Where should we next live? There's an extraordinary amount of data and Gen Zers even deciding where the family lives. So the degree that they have a voice around the dinner table is something that's new. Then they have a voice on social media because there's no deference on social media. Of course, you can call out anyone or anything. And then education too. There's no deference, as someone that works in education, right? There's no deference to your elders in education. But there's still an expectation of deference in the workplace. So these young Gen Zers that are coming into the workplace have never, it's not their fault, by the way, learned that culture of hierarchy and deference. Because it wasn't on their tech, it wasn't in their school, and it wasn't certainly around the dinner table. And so one of the reasons why a lot of businesses are struggling with Gen Z talent is because they're like, hang on, why don't you put up and shut up and work your way up like I did? And this is a triangle, a hierarchy and a triangle in which you're down there and we're up here, and you should be deferential to us. And of course, a generation that has not grown up with that level of deference, it's actually something they're having to learn at speed as well. So I think understanding that and being much more aware of social, economic, and I think particularly educational trends is one of the most important things you can do as a parent, and really think about not what do I want for my kids, not even what do they want, is how is society evolving? What skills, what level of savviness are they going to need to frankly survive in the 21st century? This is already evolving into an incredibly tumultuous time, geopolitically, economically, culturally, and technologically. And we want our kids, obviously, to survive, but ultimately thrive. And that's going to take agility, yes, and resilience. How do you build that in them is one of the most important things. And don't expect educational institutions to do it.
No, they're not going to. That's not what they're teaching. Brilliant. Dr. Filby, what a fantastic conversation. I'm so grateful for you. I'm going to put your details in the podcast notes. There'll be a link to, there'll be the details of your book and a link to how people can find you. You also have a podcast, don't you? How would you like people to find you?
I have a YouTube series coming out in spring called It's a Relative, which deals with lots of these issues. And by the way, you're not allowed to interview my son in 15 years' time to see if I've achieved anything we just talked about. Because I probably don't practice what I preach.
I bet you do. It's really interesting because I've actually started bringing my girls in to have conversations. I have an entire system which is to do with having an allowance, and I didn't want my kids to ask for money in the workplace for the first time. I wanted them to be able to discuss it with me. So I set up this system, and I've actually had my oldest daughter come in and have conversations with me about what worked and what didn't. And it's actually really interesting. It's very interesting. So yes, ask them. Okay. If you found this useful, please right now send it to at least one other person. You can find me on my website, which is www.teenagersuntangled.com. You can email me at teenagersuntangled@gmail.com. I'm on all the social media, which is the same with the Dr. Filby. Have a great week. Bye-bye for now.